Hi, I'm David Kahn, Executive Director of the Adirondack Experience, and I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening. 2 years from now, in 2023, the museum will open a major new permanent exhibit dedicated to our wonderful collection of Adirondack fine art and decorative art. The exhibit is going to be called Artists and Inspiration in the Wild. Beginning tonight and extending over the months to come, we are going to offer a regular series of programs that explore different aspects of this forthcoming exhibit. The people who we'll be chatting with will include experts in the field of Adirondack art, university-based scholars, on occasion members of the staff, as well as the designers of the exhibit itself. To kick off the series, we have a very special guest this evening, and that is Deedee Wigmore, president of Deedee Wigmore Fine Arts, a gallery in Manhattan. It was founded in 1980, and they specialize in American historic art up through the 1980s. Over many years, Deedee Wigmore has hosted many receptions at her gallery for the museum's friends in New York City, and we're very grateful for that. In addition to being a gallery owner, Deedee and her husband, Barry, are collectors, as of course was our founder, Harold Hochschild. An exhibit of the Wigmore's collection titled Aesthetic Splendors, Highlights of the Gift of Barry and Deedee Wigmore, was on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art from December of 2019 until yesterday. It was a wonderful exhibition. In case some of you missed it, do not despair. Some other items from their wonderful collection will be included in a forthcoming exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum titled Modern Gothic, the Inventive Furniture of Kimball and Cabus, 1863 to 1882. And that'll be on view from July 2 of this year until February the 13th of next year. In addition to having a home in New York City, the Wigmores are Adirondackers. They've owned a camp here since the early 1970s. Deedee knew Harold Hochschild, and we have invited her to be with us this evening to share her recollections of Harold Hochschild the man and Harold Hochschild the collector. It is he, of course, who started the museum's collection of Adirondack art, which is the largest and most important in existence. Ivy Gocker, the museum's library director, will interview Deedee. Ivy has been with us since 2016. Just a couple of years ago, she conducted a series of oral history interviews with about 10 acquaintances of Harold Hochschild. They included family members as well as people who were in his social circle here in Blue Mountain Lake. In 2018, I believe it was, Ivy presented a program featuring her interviews, and we had a wonderful crowd there. So Ivy is particularly well suited and positioned to conduct our interview and to lead the program this evening. So thank you both of our guests for being here. And before we begin, just a few pointers. If you would like to submit a question during the program, please submit it through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you're having any technical problems, please feel free to use the chat button and a member of the museum staff will respond to you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ivy and Deedee. Thank you again for being with us.
All right, thank you, David, and thank you, Deedee. It's nice to see you this evening. I did just want to mention before we sort of jump into the interview that when I did the oral history project that David mentioned, it focused a lot on Harold's personality and his love of the Adirondacks in general, and his work on the temporary study commission on the future of the Adirondack Park. But one thing that didn't really come up was his interest in art and his passion for building the museum's art collection. So I'm really glad that that's something we're going to get to talk about tonight, because I don't think that that's a subject that's been broached very much in the museum already. So thank you for giving us your firsthand knowledge of Harold and of that whole process. I guess I'll start off by, trying to lay some foundation with you. I know that you worked with him over many years to bring a lot of important pieces into the museum collection, but maybe you could start by taking us back to when you first met Harold and sort of describing the circumstances that kicked off that relationship, both with him and with the museum.
I'd love to. It's a wonderful memory. I would have been about 30 years old and director of American painting for M. Nerdler and Company, the oldest art gallery in America. And one of our owners happened to have a long-term friendship with the Albert Blakelock's family. And so we agreed to put on a large Blakelock exhibition from that estate. And Harold came to see the exhibition, which was 1973. And it was 2 floors of the gallery. And I had not met him before. My husband and I had bought an old camp in the Saranac Lake area in 1971. And both my husband and I love history. And that was one of the connections to Harold. He really looked at every painting, made observations when he had them to make. And it was wonderful in the end that he selected a Blakelock, a log cabin painting for the collection. And I'm not sure that I had been to the Adirondack Museum in those early, in 71 or 72 before I met Harold, but that purchase and the friendliness of such a dignified older man made me anxious to see the museum that the painting was going to. And Harold then invited my husband and I to visit him at Eagle's Nest when we were up that August for the summer. And I think we had many points of connection with Harold. One of the things that the museum offered me as a owner of a house was a lot of information in general about the Adirondacks. And in Saranac Lake, we had Maitland DeSarmo, who had the Seneca Ray Stoddard collection of photographs that he was actually selling in Saranac Lake in a small shop that was right near the Aubuchon hardware store. And my husband would go in to buy hardware for the camp, and I would visit Maitland DeSarmo because I was trying to find out what was available in the Adirondacks in terms of places to visit, waterfalls, old hotels, anything that I could discover that would give me more information. So visiting the Adirondack Museum, the traveling photography setup where you sat and watched photographs by Stoddard and Stieglitz pass by you, and you could look for as long as you wanted and discover all kinds of places that you'd never seen before. And that was really a wonderful thing that the museum offered that I discovered through visiting it. And
it sounds like it's a bit of a lucky coincidence that you met Harold at the same time that you were getting interested in the Adirondacks in your
totally.
own, right?
Totally. Well, and I think the spirit that he had that inviting my husband and I to lunch a couple of times, also transcended to the museum staff, because we came to, we learned from Ted Comstock, Bill Werner, Caroline Welsh, Pat Mandel, Craig Gilburn, and all of them had special focuses of interest, because the museum was really offered a very broad look at what had gone on in the Adirondacks, but to us as young people, what we could embrace as a hobby, an interest, a collection. There was just so much that the museum offered that we really needed it at that time. And I think of all the new buyers of homes in the Adirondacks, because there is a kind of generational turnover going on right now, with real interest in kind of nature and wild places where nature exists in a big way. And I think the museum is going to be very important to those newcomers to find how to decorate, who was here, everything from poetry to being able to hike, the hikes that are available. All of that is really right there at the museum on offer.
Yeah, you mentioned that sort of generational turnover, and that makes me think of something we had spoken about when we were preparing for this. And I'm wondering, in that moment when you first met Harold at that Blakelock exhibition, was Adirondack art a popular form right then? Had it fallen out of favor? Like, where, I guess, on the trajectory of popularity of the kind of landscapes that that are associated with the Adirondacks now, was that sort of work popular at that time, or yeah, what was happening in the market there?
Well, that was actually, I think, probably why I was allowed to become a director of a department so young, was that the American area was really just being reassessed and rediscovered. And we really owed so much to history-minded scholars who were quickly uncovering through work in libraries and other museums to discover what went on. And I think I feel very lucky in that from the 70s forward to about the 1990s, the information slowly grew so that we were able to separate out who the big artists were, who the small artists were, who the rare ones were. All of those things were finally figured out. And it was a very exciting time, because I think you were in a period of discovery where almost anything might turn up. And I will say, in those early days, I'd be seated at my desk and the mail would come in, and I'd open a letter from somebody, and there would be a photograph of a 19th century painting. And honestly, so many of them were still in their original shadow boxes. Sometimes it was two farmers with a large painting that they were holding up in its original shadow box, asking me if I would be interested. And it was all out there to be discovered. People, the relatives of many of the artists, like we visited the Thomas Cole estate several times because we were taking paintings from Cole. And pretty much all the great artists we had access to at that point. Nerdler actually represented Frederick Remington for his lifetime. So we had a lot of records and material.
Mm-hmm. Since we're talking about the Blakelock I think I'll share so that everybody can see that painting. So this is the untitled log cabin that you referenced before. And so this was the first painting that you sold to Harold for the museum, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And yeah, did he, at the time, did you get much of an impression of what he was trying to do with the museum or with the art collection?
I think Harold said he had been thinking about creating a museum during the 1940s. And that I looked up his beginnings, and I think he incorporated the museum in 1947. And it took him to 1957 to actually start to create a campus. So I think like the interest in painting, it's in some ways, we didn't have enough information to know site-specific locations for many things. Even though the family of the artists we were working with, it wasn't always known the location. So I kind of feel that for this Blakelock, he did visit the Adirondacks, and what you try and do is at least get a painting that's from the same moment of artist visits. If there is nothing in the picture that tells you that it is at a specific location. So I think so much more information has come in for artists that today, when I am speaking to staff at the Adirondack Museum, that we are able to look at mountaintops and elevations and all locations with a similar name to get much more accurately attached to the location. And I think Harold really made a leap of faith. I have the feeling that he was, from what he had created that I experienced in the 70s, was a general museum that was, in a sense, to speak to the Adirondack experience and what nature looks like in the Adirondacks. So that's, I think, how he chose the Blakelock. I remember I liked another picture, which we discussed, which was a country road, more like the kind of road that you would have into Eagle's Nest or a camp, that was just a dirt road. And again, it was autumn, and a couple was walking towards the top of it on the path with a hill rising above them. And I felt it was like an autumn walk that my husband and I had at our camp that made me think of the Adirondacks just in looking at it. So we discussed different paintings as we walked through that exhibition and exchanged feelings about what the painting expressed in terms of the emotion of the artist in painting it.
Remember, he had Homer.
That's really interesting too, because I think in developing this exhibit, this showcase of our art collections, we here have been talking a lot about how this sense of place is really what defines Adirondack art, and how that can be different for different people based on what part of the park they're visiting or what kind of activities they engage with here. I guess I'm curious, if you think that there's something that would define an Adirondack aesthetic in art, or if Harold saw something specific that would define Adirondack art for him.
Well, I think looking at the Adirondacks itself, 19th century, 1850 is when the artists started to come to the Adirondacks. In the 1830s, I think 1836 to 1837, you had the geological surveys, and really thinking about Harold and the fact that his business related to mining. I wondered whether some of the early attraction might have been all of the geological aspects of the Adirondacks. Every area has some mining aspect. In Saranac Lake, we have moonstone and is it amethyst?
Garnet, maybe?
Garnet, yes. We had mining of those areas, and I think they've now become more like kitchen counters, is what the garnets have become, more like marble. But in my original sort of exploration of what the Adirondacks could offer, I looked at the sort of magazine commissions that were offered to our 19th century artists by the Crayon and other weekly and monthly magazines, and collected those as a way of seeing what artists came to the Adirondacks. And there was an equal number from America, mostly New York, and from Montreal and Toronto. And I thought, I wonder, as the 19th century sort of evolved, I wondered as a dealer whether I would see any works by those artists, and looked for them because of those articles about the Adirondacks, hoping to discover more that came from trips that were discussed in those articles.
Since we are talking about other artists, I have some other images here. Let's see if I can scroll through them. These are all, 19th century painters that Harold collected through you. So I just want to give our viewers some sense of some of what we're talking about here tonight. And if any of these, if there's anything you want to say about any of these, please stop me, and I can let us pause on any image. But this is just a sampling also of what has come into the collection through you. But again, I know you mentioned Frederick Remington a little while ago, and I think I also have, a Thomas Cole here.
Thomas Cole.
Of Scroon Lake.
Well, in some ways, the museum could consider its collection nationally famous artists, of which you have many. Thomas Cole would be one, but he didn't really, I think he came to the Adirondack twice. And Asher B. Durand came with him one time. Sanford Gifford is probably the most desired of the 19th century painters because of the way he captures light. And of course, thinking of that Blakelock, autumn and evening light are two of the things which he captures. Frederick Remington is, there's your
Yes.
Adirondack view by Gifford, which is probably the most desired Gifford that I know of. I mean, it is a fabulous picture. And it incorporates the sporting life, which was very important to bring people into the area, with the lean-to and the sense that fishing is going on, and because the fire's lit, you feel like they've already successfully caught what they're going to have for dinner. Frederick Remington has fewer Adirondack pictures. Really, there's a very short period of his life where he connects to the Adirondacks. And so, again, it's a prize to have one because there's really only a handful of paintings like this that one could get if you wanted to form an Adirondack collection. But you also have a collection that has artists that are perhaps not as nationally famous, but are more important to the Adirondacks itself, because, like Rockwell Kent, because he lived here, or Harold Weston, because he lived in Keene Valley and helped build the Trail Association there. And in some ways, I think Harold started his interest in the Adirondacks. There's a self-portrait that is terribly sweet of Harold Weston. You know, you never know as a dealer when something special is going to come in, but this came in just in time for your Harold Weston exhibition. So it was nice to have that portrait to offer.
Right.
But
yeah. Go ahead.
You do have a number of artists that are regular visitors to the Adirondacks. Levi Wells Prentice. I think the reason why the museum has had certain large exhibitions in your history have been focused on artists who really gave the Adirondacks a lot of time and moved around enough that you get a sense of how much the area has to offer. So that, you know, there's sort of two ways of juggling what's important, and you have both.
Don Wynn.
Yes, my husband brings up Don Wynn. You've had very few exhibitions of contemporary artists. I kind of think that is trying to be, you feel like you're leading people to the best of whatever it is, whether it's canoes or paintings. And that for contemporary artists, you've only wanted to have someone who had a career that was successful with a good dealer and broader interest in order to feel that you could offer them to Adirondack buyers and say, well, this is a quality artist. It's very hard when you don't have those kind of credentials to choose a contemporary artist for your collection, because in a sense, you are telling people good, better, best. And the news isn't in the career of a contemporary artist. One never knows how long that career is, or where the sweet spot is, or how much of the Adirondacks will actually be presented. And so I think the museum has done a very good job of bringing it up to through the 1940s. And it's harder in the 50s because that's the big moment where abstract expressionism dominates the market. And, you know, beyond that, we're still all uncovering a lot of art.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, we are a history museum also. So I think that we're always kind of looking back rather
Yeah.
than, you know, it's
Well, that's very
instinct to look
safe.
back. Yeah.
That's safe.
It's very
By then, it's very helpful too, because it is not influenced by the politics of the moment. Really, the real facts tend to eventually come to light. And so I think that the approach of the museum is really a very good guide for people to really understand things. And I feel that you offer, for those that, I mean, the museum is very broad, so they can have the pleasure of just seeing beautiful things, or if there's an area where they want expertise, whether it's in boating or fishing or whatever, rustic furniture. There's also a moment when things come to full bloom. And, you know, if you think about the 19th century for the Adirondacks is, in terms of art, as beginning in 1850, it took a while for full bloom to come on. It took a while till we get to Sanford Gifford, and actually Gifford's first attempts at using that strong color to create beautiful light created problems for the surface of his paintings. We had problems with alligatoring with those early paints. So you don't have, you would never buy a picture like that, but you know, it's like a very bad paint job. And it's a real problem that lasted for about 2 years broadly within the 19th century painters, while the materials were being improved, partly through the critique of the artist, because if something doesn't work and you're the manufacturer, you hear about it. And
Right.
so they tinker. And that is something that happens as materials change over time too. You see as a dealer moments where the paper has changed and it's not as good, or it's become better. You know, my gallery deals all the way up. Right now we're in the 1960s in the gallery show. And it's the moment when, because of American inventiveness during World War II, that plastics and acrylic paint, which is a new plastic paint that dries quickly, is being used by artists, and they are speaking to the manufacturer, tweaking the materials as they use them because problems occur. And so this is just something which is a good reason why to look backward, because you can jump over the problems and only have the good.
Right. And that's a good reminder too, that these artists are inventive and they're innovating in their own time. And so even when we look at it with the perspective of history, we need to remember what it was like for them in that moment to be trying new things that that seem traditional to us now. I want to get back a little bit to your experiences with Harold directly. I think you mentioned that you visited his home at Eagle's Nest. I'm wondering if you have any memories of what it was like there, and also if you had any art hanging there in his camp.
Well, my husband felt he had the most beautiful road into his camp. And the road took you past stables and tennis courts. And it was a real family compound, with each family had a different style house. And Harold's home was modern, but yet it felt a little more 19th century. And that might have been furnishings. It was just an impression I had.
Arts and crafts.
He did have art. We remember that he had a Winslow Homer, which is, Homer is one of those big international names where, again, there are a small supply, certainly a small supply that our Adirondack views, because so much of his art seems to be Boston area. And so you really have fabulous Homers. I don't know whether anything by Homer came to you from Harold, because he also had other family members that may have put their name on something, but he certainly had Homer, and he had art in his home.
And we've heard, when I did the oral history about Harold, we heard from a lot of people that he was very welcoming of young people into his circle, and that he liked to connect people who might come from different walks of life but have similar interests. And I'm just curious if that was something you and Barry experienced, since you were much younger than Harold when you got to know.
Much younger. It was truly an honor as a 30-year-old to be invited to Eagle's Nest by a man who clearly was a successful and powerful man. I don't know. We felt that his opening his home to us was something that made us feel very connected to the museum that he was trying to build. And I think that the spirit of embracing people who were interested in history, nature, a lot of things, we felt that. And I think his staff at the museum all were very open to all people that showed interest because of him.
Mm-hmm. And then thinking we're getting close to 45 minutes here, and I know we want to leave time for question and answers also. So I guess I'll ask maybe a big picture question about who you feel are the most important Adirondack painters, and maybe you've touched on this a bit, but also if there are any painters that you think are under-recognized that could use a bit more attention.
I think the Adirondack painters that should be the most important to people who are trying to form an Adirondack collection. Someone like A.F. Tate, who was a sporting artist, but he lived in the Adirondacks for months every year, right up to towards the end of his life, was a hugely successful artist, and really painted animals in the landscape with a great deal of compassion for the experience of being a wild creature, looking for their living in the landscape, but also hunted. And so you get, I think he would be someone that I would feel would be a major player as a painter for the Adirondacks. I think, for fame, you can't get beyond Sanford Gifford, Asher B. Durand, Thomas Cole, but they really came to the Adirondacks briefly. And you could cite Georgia O'Keefe. I love these. And you can see he really understood the otter's joy in catching something like that. And I think the first visit we ever made to the Sable was because it was a brown trout stream, and we had friends who were fishing the whole Sable loop, and we were anxious to see what the brown trout were doing. So that's a great take. I think you also have paintings which are not nationally famous, but are really rare and special. Like you have the Philosopher's Camp by Stillman. I think there's only 3 known paintings by him. And it really is something that talks about like-minded people, men in this case, coming together in the Adirondacks, not for the wildlife, for the experience of being together, exchanging ideas and views. It feels so poetic to think that you have a philosopher's camp. And I've as a dealer, I've looked for another Stillman for years and have yet to find one. But I think of that as one of your great treasures. Not a major name, not like Georgia OKeefe. Now, Georgia OKeefe would be someone that you'd be invited to loan your Georgia OKeefe to many, major exhibitions now and into the future. But she really did very little related to the Adirondack. She was at Lake George and painted a few views of Lake George.
Yeah, I mean, is there anything that we didn't touch on yet that you were hoping to elaborate on, either on the collection or on Harold, before we go to question and answers?
I am just so pleased that the museum is coming up with a major exhibition to honor the museum that Harold built. I think of this as, if you count back to 1947, when he incorporated the museum, it's a 76-year-old celebration of having developed over 76 years. Or you could just say, well, it's from when the campus first started being built, that'd be 1957 forward, but that's still a lot of time. You're still in the almost 70 years. Mm-hmm. So it's a wonderful honor to be asked to celebrate this great museum that has done so much to inform us about the Adirondacks, to help us to build a collection in our camp, to furnish it, to find things to read that are interesting, to places to go that we want to see. It's wonderful.
Yeah, that reminds me, I should mention, when you talk about Harold's accomplishment in establishing the museum, he also literally wrote the book on our part of the Adirondacks, Township 34. This came out in 1952. So, I mean, this was in addition to him having a full-time job that took him all over the world as an executive at his mining company. So somehow, in his whatever free time he had, he managed to write a book and establish a museum and build up this art collection. So yeah,
and it's very readable.
Yeah,
and it has wonderful pictures of old hotels and railroads. He really gives a overview of what was happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have some time for question and answer, and I received a question from a friend of the museum, Margot Ernst, before we even had the discussion that I wanted to bring up. So she wanted me to ask if you feel it was Harold's intent to keep collecting major art in the modern era. He passed away in 1981, of course, so I don't know if you had any sense of what his vision was for the museum's art collection going forward from that point.
I think in some respects, I mean, he was interested in history. So I think if a major artist created something about the Adirondacks, I think he would be interested and would want to include it in his collection, or at least want to cover it with an exhibition or a discussion that provided it for his people. I think he was, you know, it's not just for us who have camps here, but the local people have a real point of pride in the accomplishments of various things that have gone on here. And it may be that the way you've incorporated those things within the museum really touches us all. And I think Harold would want that to continue.
Margot had a follow-up question too about some of these major names that you mentioned before, like Georgia O'Keeffe. Is it too late for us to realistically try to get some of those very well-known artists who have some Adirondack art? Is it too late for us to get that into the collection? She mentioned specifically Georgia O'Keeffe or David Smith's sculpture.
I think it's never too late, because I think that the museum itself is a focal point for people who can afford those $1 million paintings. And, you know, we're always hearing about the billionaires and the millionaires out there. But there are sometimes people who just happen to be in the right place at the right time, and they get that O'Keefe or that David Smith, or a foundation that the artist has set up where you can tell them why it would mean so much to the museum to have something from them, and you get it as a gift. And I know from my experience with museums that people like to see something that they have felt was important and that they've loved in a secure home for the future, because it really doesn't, you have no assurance as time goes on that the things that you're interested in will be of interest to the next generation. All you can do is provide the best of what you can, so that there is that opportunity for people to look back and say, oh, David Smith was important to the Adirondacks. He was here at Bolton Landing. And so I think it's never too late.
And I guess dovetailing on that, we had another question of who, if anybody, do you think the museum should look to be collecting next?
I think photography is something that has really grown in terms of its stature to be co-equal with painting. You have Nathan Farb as a treasure here in the Adirondacks, and his Cibachrome photographs are large and really take you into nature.
Elegant.
They're elegant. And you have already the foundation of two great artists, photographers, with Stieglitz and Seneca Ray Stoddard. And I know you have other photography holdings as well. So that might be an area where more seems to come into the marketplace without people necessarily separating out Adirondacks versus Yosemite versus Maine. People oftentimes collect a particular location. And so there's, I think, plenty of opportunity to add photography. And I know that most of the regional museums are incorporating some photography in the painting rooms once photography starts being sort of considered as co-equal. And you almost could have a overview to decide when that happens. I know that with in the 1930s and 40s, with artists like Ben Shahn photographing the areas hit by depression and drought, that sort of is a generation where photography told a story that people couldn't get entirely from paintings. So that is like an area that could be explored.
We have another question. Oh, I think this might be a
Yeah, this is a Nathan Farb. Yes.
Beautiful one. Really striking. We had another question. Someone was curious to know more about your backgrounds, I guess, before you came to Nerdler in the 1970s.
I really came to Nerdler right out of college and started at the bottom as an assistant to one of the older salespeople and kind of worked my way along. And Nerdler at that time represented internationally Henry Moore and Salvador Dali and many famous French artists, but also we had Frederick Remington had represented him, Fairfield Porter, Winslow Homer, and we had a warehouse over on the west side in Manhattan where one entire wall was Albert Bierstadt. And we actually still had created all the sort of various odds and ends from Maximilian Zooweed's sort of tour of the United States. So we went back a very long way. And as director of American Painting, my job was to balance. I was given a certain amount of money as my budget for a season. And I had to balance the colonial period and the 19th century and American Impressionism. Now, all of those were being explored. So think of how the interest in 18th century furniture, colonial furniture, would have sort of started at that time alongside interest in the 19th century. I think the American West was the first approach because of the great surveys across the country that were on horseback by the Army. So we progressed from there, and I learned as I went along. And then leaving Nerdler, I became, I sort of ran the sales staff at Kennedy Galleries. I worked for Larry Fleischman and Rudy Wunderlich. And Rudy, as you know, his family had a camp in the Adirondacks that went back to Herman Wunderlich. And I think that family's interest in the Adirondacks was in both land and hops for brewing beer, I was told. And obviously that didn't metamorphose into a brewing family, but an art family for many generations. And of course, the Fleischmans were famous collectors. And so it was a wonderful and very different gallery from Nerdler. It was focused purely on American art. And so at Nerdler, in balancing my the money I had for my department, I only looked at the top artists like Winslow Homer or Sanford Gifford, never below them, because the money had to stretch over many different fields here. So at Kennedy, it was the 1,000th tier to the top tier. And so it was a great education in quality and in identifying the hand of one artist rather than another. And it has stood me in good stead for a long time. And Harold actually selected pictures from Kennedy galleries. We, as being purely American paintings, it was like the storehouse for the ages of material. And it was always so much fun to pull together a selection for him to look at.
I have one more quick question that came in, asking if you know of a watercolorist who lived in Blue Mountain Lake named Gene Wilson.
Name?
Gene Wilson?
No.
Okay. that was one last question that came up. And yeah, we're pretty much out of time. So I wanted to thank you.
Very nice to be with you for this evening.
Yes.
And to talk about a man and a museum that we all love.
Yes, definitely. I do have a couple quick announcements before we wrap up for the night. So thank everyone. Thank you, Deedee, for sharing everything you know, and thanks to everybody who attended. The next programs in this series, Artists and Inspiration, will be May 17th when we have art historian Melody Dusner speaking about late 19th century American paintings. And then on June 21st, we will be coming live from the studio of Adirondack artist Barney Bellinger. From what I hear, his studio is very interesting. But you can learn more about these programs on our website and keep an eye on your email for registration information. So thanks again to everybody who came, and thank you so much, Deedee, for sharing all of your memories. And
Pleasure. Pleasure.
all right, have a wonderful night.
You too.